how to never get hungry. I found this way of reducing hunger to pretty much nothing, right? And I've found that you are as hungry as the amount of carbs in your last meal. So if your meal has high carbs, you will get hungry pretty much straight away. You'll be hungry straight after, and then you'll be hungry consistently until you eat again. If your last meal had high fat and or protein, so high fat, high protein and low carbs, so that's a keto style meal, hunger's pretty much non-existent. And if you think about normal foods that you normally eat, and like food industry foods, so these, we're not talking real foods, we're talking food industry hyper processed foods, they're all full of carbs. You think of a normal breakfast like toast, bread, carbs, cereal, carbs, a sandwich for lunch is carbs, pasta, carbs, so they're all carbs. So what happens is you wake up, you eat your first meal, which is full of carbs, and then you're hungry, and then you want to eat a snack, and then that will probably have carbs in it, so you're perpetually hungry throughout the day. Now just because that's the norm doesn't mean just because that's kind of how society operates and we've all eaten that way, doesn't mean that's normal. If you look at traditional diets, tribes people might eat just meat. They might have a hunt and a kill and then just eat meat, or they might forage and just eat fruit, for example. So just because we have carbs in every meal doesn't make it normal. But what I've found is, so for me, I eat pretty much just meat and fruit, and I'll do my first meal, sometimes will be exclusively fruit, and I'll be really hungry after that. So I eat my first meal around 9 a.m. and then midday is my next one. So for that 3 hours, I'm extremely hungry. And then the next meal is usually mixed, so meat and fruit. And then my last meal is at 3 p.m. because I know I'm not going to eat again until 9 a.m. So I think that's either 16 or 18 hour fasting window. I make sure that last meal is high protein, high fat. So that's usually meat, cheese, eggs, bacon. That's a meat, I know, but so it will just be no fruit. There's no carbs in that last meal, or minimal carbs, and then I have pretty much no hunger all the way through, because the body is satiated by the high protein, high fat for some reason. I don't know why, but the sugar and carbs create hunger. The other part of not being hungry is intermittent fasting and sticking to meals. So when you eat your first meal that's full of carbs and then you're hungry like an hour later and then you snack, each time you're spiking insulin, and that's going to stimulate hunger for you to eat again. Whereas if you stick to meals, so you have your first meal at 9 a.m. and then don't eat until 12 o'clock, insulin can regulate and then hunger goes away. And that happens quicker, it seems, when you eat just protein and fat. I'm guessing it's because it doesn't spike insulin as much. So you want to eat, if you know, you can kind of tolerate hunger from breakfast to lunch and then from lunch to dinner. But from dinner until breakfast the next day, that might be where you slip up. So for me, I'm quite strategic. So my method is, the actionable step is, have a strategic last meal of the day, which is high fat, high protein, low carbs, and hunger will be pretty much non-existent. And then obviously the second part of that is stick to an eating window and stick to intermittent fasting. So stick to your meals, have 3 or 4 meals a day with at least 2 hours between them. Your last meal, you don't eat anything. The high fat, high protein meal, you don't eat anything until breakfast the next day. Ideally, you want that to be a 16-hour fasting window. And when you do that, it allows insulin to drop and regulate, and then you won't be hungry. So yeah, that's how I avoid hunger. Whereas before, I would eat, when I was following a normal diet, which is basically eat what you want but just eat it in moderation within like a caloric restriction, I would just be hungry because everything I was eating had carbs in it. Whereas this way, and the other thing, it's like a psychological way of not being hungry as well, because once you've eaten your last meal, say you've got a craving for a certain thing that might be high carb, my breakfast the next day is usually high carb anyway, because you've got all day for that insulin to regulate. So psychologically you can say, well, I can eat the thing, say it's a donut you want, although I advocate real food diet, not processed food, but say it's a donut, you can say, right, I can have it, I just can't have it until tomorrow morning, and then have it in the morning. So psychologically, if you say to yourself, I'm never eating donuts ever again, that would mess you up and make it hard to stick to the diet. But you're saying, I can have it, I can just have it tomorrow morning. So yeah, so I've found that, and I've helped other people lose weight, and they've said the most effective part of it is that last meal. Mine's at 3 p.m, but for other people I've said 5 p.m. as the last meal. And it's like a psychological barrier. Once the clock goes over 5, you just can't eat. There's no, with a traditional dieting regime, you eat what you want, but just less of it. There's always like them little mind games you play where you're like, well, I had one biscuit, but I would normally have like 6. So if I have 2, that's fine. And then 2 becomes 3, and you can kind of convince yourself. But if you set a time limit, an intermittent fasting window, the moment that clock goes past 5 p.m, you can't eat. There's like no, you can't argue with a clock. Do you know what I mean? It is what it is. It's past 5, no eating. And then you know you can eat carbs at breakfast the next day. There's just no, because if you're left to your own devices, if overeating and gaining weight is a problem to you, left to your own devices, you will mess up. That's just the nature of it. That's why you're on a diet. Do you know what I mean? So you've got to make choice. I've done videos on, and I talk about willpower not existing. So you don't really have a choice, but you choose. The only choice we have is our environment. So I would say the eating window is kind of like an environment choice. I'm choosing to eat within this time. So I don't know, that I kind of rambled at the end there, but so yeah, my actionable step is implement intermittent fasting, 3 or 4 meals a day without snacks in between, and make your last meal a strategic high fat, high protein, low carb meal, and that will help you feel satiated for longer and you won't have to deal with hunger. Done.